Over the last several months in the US, news headlines have increasingly focused on topics regarding children. Everything from school shootings to bans on gender-affirming care for those under 18, to bans on books and ideas in schools, to the controversies surrounding the accusations of drag queens and transgender individuals grooming children, and the recent findings of investigations surrounding the abuse of children by Catholic clergy in Boston have dominated both mainstream and alternative media coverage. But within the maelstrom of political discourse, nobody seems to be asking an incredibly crucial question, one which, if answered, would provide a solid foundation for beginning to deal more rationally with the current political issues regarding children. This question is, what is a child? Answering this question not only can light a path through our turbulent political scene, but it can also elucidate to some extent the meaning of adulthood. While there are plenty of pediatric and psychological studies on the development and general disposition of children, this video will take a different approach. Here I intend to examine the thoughts regarding children as articulated by two philosophers, highly antagonistic to one another, to show the underpinnings of how we today often already think of children. By examining these two perspectives and critiquing both, we will clear away some of the rubble that obstructs us from more clearly examining this question. In other words, by demonstrating what a child is not, we are in a better position to answer what a child might be. Finally, we can return to the issues of today concerning children, and provide some preliminary suggestions that could guide government policy in the future. Obviously, the question of what a child is one far too broad to be answered fully in a relatively short video, but I hope to at least provide somewhat of a starting point. The first of the two philosophers we will discuss is Augustine of Hippo. Alive in the 4th and 5th centuries CE, he was a convert to Catholicism from Manichaeanism, and many of his writings, particularly his Confessions and City of God, had one of the most decisive impacts on the formulation of Catholic doctrine to this day. By his own account, Augustine had lived a rough and sinful life, even from his infancy. In Book 1 of his spiritual autobiography, The Confessions, he states that eventually, quote, "I realized where I was and wanted to express my desires to those who could satisfy them, but I could not. So I flung my limbs and voice at random, making the few signs I could, suggesting, though very inadequately, by signs or sounds what it was I wanted. And when I was not presently satisfied, because what I wanted either was not understood or was not good for me, I grew indignant that my elders were not subject to me, angry with those who owed me no service, for not serving me, and avenged myself on them by tears." End quote. Augustine says several times how he knows this was his behavior as a child, because he has seen it in many other children long since then. But it is his explanation of this behavior that is most important. He says, quote, "For in your," that is God's, "sight, no one is free from sin, not even the infant whose life is but a day upon the earth." End quote. This is the core Christian belief of original sin at play. The idea that all humans carry with them the guilt of the first sin of Adam and Eve, and are therefore predisposed to commit further sins because of this. Augustine continues by explaining how he would cry and physically lash out at others when he did not get his way. His explanation for this behavior further expounds upon his belief in the active presence of original sin within the infant. He says, quote, "Then in the weakness of infant limbs, not its will, lies its innocence." End quote. Hence, taken altogether, we can see that original sin seems to have a kind of stranglehold on the human will, long before a child can even understand what they are doing, and that the innocence of a child, if it can even be called innocence, lies only in how physically ineffective they are in executing their will. This little bit from Augustine is already able to be spotted in contemporary political discourse. We all know this memified clip from PragerU, but listen closely to what Dennis Prager says about infants.
Babies are lovable and innocent, but they're not good. They're entirely self-centered, as they have to be in order to survive. I want mommy, I want milk, I want to be held, I want to be comforted. And if you do not do all these things immediately, I will ruin your life. That's not goodness, that's narcissism.
We can hear echoes of Augustine's perspective on infant behavior in Dennis Prager's monologue, but especially in the words, "That's not goodness, that's narcissism." Notice also how Dennis Prager renders the baby's tantrum into a clearly articulated and verbalized set of demands, as if to imply that somehow the baby is consciously, intelligently, and freely thinking these things. Here, the parallels abound. By ascribing narcissism to the infant the same way Augustine ascribes original sin, by denying that babies are innocent, and by attributing a kind of willful evil to the child, both Augustine and Dennis Prager assign an essential moral quality to the child's very ontological status. It is an ambiguous quality, however, for on the one hand, these children are willfully, if not intelligently, choosing to be evil, while on the other hand, something intrinsic to them binds their will such that they could not choose not to be evil. Given how often Dennis Prager speaks about Judeo-Christian values, it would be no surprise if he also points to original sin as the ultimate cause of this deplorable state of babies. Therefore, we can see how this Augustinian pessimism surrounding the human condition still affects the way some think today. Of course, Augustine doesn't stop there. Ending Book 1 of his Confessions with the age of 15, he confesses to an entire litany of other youthful indiscretions. A hatred of learning, the love of praise of displaying his eventual proficiency in learning, his intrigue into the lurid Roman legends, and even some instances of kleptomania, particularly stealing pears from someone else's tree just to steal them, not even to eat them. As he spirals headlong into the sinful mire, he says how only coercion was able to keep him learning, although he does not think it kept him from sinning. Of course, neither did his baptism, which was delayed until somewhat later in life by his mother Monica, who was already a convert to Catholicism at this point. But here concludes his examination of his childhood, along with his perspective of what causes a child, from its earliest moments, to be so thoroughly corrupt. Original sin. What can we say in response to Augustine's perspective? The most crucial aspect is whether or not there is such a thing as original sin. If there is not, his explanation falls apart, plain and simple. But even if there is such a thing as original sin, it does not necessitate his views on what follows from it. As stated earlier, Augustine had one of the biggest roles in formulating Catholic doctrine, and ostensibly Christian belief in general, up to this day. But even the Catholic Church of today dissents from Augustine's perspective to an extent. Their belief is that children who have reached the age of reason, which is generally believed to be about 7 years old, and are therefore able to commit mortal sins, that is, put simply, the ability to know that something is sinful and to freely choose to do it anyway. But under that age, children have less culpability, but this does not necessarily preclude them from being able to sin altogether. Venial sins, that is, sins where one does not know an action is wrong or wherein the action is of a lesser moral gravity, are still very much in the realm of possibility for children under the age of reason, at least in theory. But the question remains for theologians whether or not an infant even has free will, to what extent the presence or absence of an intellect is a precondition of the freedom of the will, and what the impact of a diminished or absent freedom of the will is on one's accountability for their sinful action. But returning to the main crux of Augustine's argument, we must ask how plausible or demonstrable the existence of original sin truly is. While that is far beyond the scope of this video, we can at least briefly pose a few questions that would help us test the belief. Is there a more thorough explanation for a child's behavior than original sin? Why should one believe in Augustine's account of original sin over similar stories from other thinkers and cultures, such as Plato's idea of the recollection of the forms, or the Aztec creation story wherein humans were once made of perfect material, but were then reshaped by the gods to be imperfect, so as not to challenge them? What evidence is there for the conditions which caused humans to have original sin, or something like it? With questions like these, we can neither confirm nor deny the existence of original sin, and therefore Augustine's judgment on children should be suspended and held in doubt. It is still an attractive view, however, because it proposes to explain how a 6-year-old child could shoot his teacher at school, or why 2 teenagers murdered their classmate Brianna Gay in a public park, or how the infamous Columbine shooting could have happened. Humans are indeed capable of evil, and some, it would seem, exercise that ability quite early in life. But now we turn our attention to another famous philosopher, one who parallels Augustine yet appears to be his complete opposite, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau imagines that humans once lived in a state of nature, or original state before the advent of civilization, in which they were solitary and free from obligations to one another. Contact between humans who met by chance resulted in procreation, and the rearing of children lasted only as long as it had to. Nothing really bound these early humans together, until finally the burden of subsistence living forced them into small communities. It is here that the most pivotal moment in human development occurs. When, in the state of nature, humans are driven by the amour de soi, or love of self that acted as the instinct towards self-preservation. But when they formed the earliest societies, men began to sexually compete for women, which turned the amour de soi into the amour propre, a different kind of love of self that more closely resembles vanity. Once this competitive and comparative amour propre was coupled with the establishment of private property, inequality among humans flourished, and humans gradually fell further and further away from their original freedom in the state of nature. To bargain with those who had property, those who did not had to fritter away their freedom through labor for property owners, just to eke out a meager existence. And in deliberately misrepresenting their own desires, so as not to anger their superiors, humans continued to sink deeper into oppression. The amour propre that is at the heart of the human species' descent into oppression is the target of Rousseau's pedagogical method outlined in his treatise Emile. Unlike previous models of education wherein children are forced to conform to a standardized curriculum, the educational process is tailored to fit the child as they slowly reveal their own natural talents and potential. This independent and spontaneous discovery by the child of their own talents, and the need to avoid coercing them in a certain standard direction, emanates from one of Rousseau's most essential tenets, that humans are naturally good. It is the amour propre and the institution of private property that can lead them astray from their natural goodness. However, the amour propre can be harnessed and redirected in a constructive manner by being mediated through the passion of pitié, or compassion. In this way, a child nearing young adulthood can respect himself, seek recognition and respect from others, and recognize and respect others without doing so competitively. Clearly, Rousseau's method of education has not been adopted in the modern world, let alone in the United States. In many respects, curriculum has become even more standardized, especially with the advent of standardized testing. One could argue that the reason why modern Americans think of education, especially higher education, as nothing more than job training is because the institution of private property has metastasized and grown unchecked. Furthermore, the amour propre of which Rousseau was so wary could be at the heart of the incel movement, since so much of that perspective is focused on the question of why its adherents do not believe they are sexually competitive enough. And when self-described incels choose role models such as Andrew Tate, who flaunts his wealth and possessions and heralds them as goals for which to strive, we can see the intersection of the amour propre and the institution of private property, and how it illuminates, if not creates, inequality. We can also see to some extent how the idea that a child will discover their abilities all on their own due to their natural goodness carries forward into today. Implicit within this idea is a strong trust in the child to intuitively find their way toward what is right for them. In a similar fashion, many psychologists today maintain that, among transgender individuals, most knew from an early age who they really were and felt the need to transition. This is not to say that gender identity is natural talent to be discovered and developed, and it is highly unlikely that Rousseau would have even comprehended the notion of being transgender. Rather, like those talents and abilities within the child waiting to blossom all of their own accord, it can be argued that many today believe that a person's gender will reveal itself at an early age, even if that gender does not match the body. Given the explanatory power that Rousseau's state of nature and philosophy of education have in the modern world, how can we critique it? Rousseau himself denies that his narrative of the state of nature is an account of what actually happened in human history. But according to the late anthropologist David Graeber, many historians and anthropologists have taken Rousseau's account literally. Of course, this is not Rousseau's fault, but rather the fault of those who have misread him. However, one obvious deficiency of Rousseau's perspective on education is that it is tailored exclusively toward men. In fact, the entire concept of the amour propre seems to be a strictly masculine phenomenon, wherein men compete for sexual access to women. This glosses over the possibility of women competing for men, even if it is in subtler or more covert methods. To view the amour propre as a human phenomenon rather than a strictly male phenomenon would radically alter the picture of society. But insofar as Rousseau excludes women from his consideration except for being the objects of male desire, he inadvertently perpetuates the same oppression his method of education seeks to eradicate. Finally, even though Rousseau emphasizes the child's ability to independently discover his natural talents, he also states that the educator must carefully fine-tune the educational environment to minimize distractions and facilitate learning. Within such a manipulated and artificial environment, to what extent can we then describe the child's process of discovery as independent or natural? In Rousseau's view, is not such independent and natural discovery actually impossible outside of the state of nature, a state he only believed in as an allegory in the first place? Rousseau's perspective appears as a mere opposite of Augustine's, but is therefore very similar in that respect. While Augustine believes that humans are corrupted by original sin and their wills held captive by it, unless liberated to some extent by the grace bestowed through baptism, Rousseau believes that humans are by nature good, but have undergone a gradual process of corruption through the development of an artificial sentiment and the institution of private property. Put more simply, Augustine believes man is fallen and in need of saving, while Rousseau believes man is falling, but can be redirected toward a nobler future. Furthermore, Augustine says that he could not have persisted in his predetermined course of studies without discipline and coercion. Rousseau, however, sees the child as the one who determines the course of education through the spontaneous discovery of natural talents, and that coercion must be avoided at all costs, so as not to perpetuate the social dynamics of domination and subordination. Next, both believe that some form of intervention is necessary for the child to develop properly in a desirable direction, though Augustine believes this is a supernatural intervention, while Rousseau believes it is an artificial one. Dovetailing on that is the end of the desired direction, which for Augustine is for man to inhabit the city of God rather than the city of man, whereas for Rousseau, man and his society can be perfected in this life. Now that we have compared both Augustine of Hippo and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and examined the merits and deficiencies of their perspectives, we can return to the question of what a child is not. Without an empirical demonstration of the existence of original sin, let alone its origins, Augustine's view is unhelpful. Furthermore, his observations of the behavior of children exclude any good that they may do, good which many others observe on a daily basis. On the other hand, Rousseau's rosy view of children naturally gravitating toward that at which they will excel without the need for coercion seems to exclude how unruly children actually can be. If Rousseau had been the mentor of a child Augustine, who stated his hatred for learning in his youth, would Rousseau have been able to teach him anything at all? And would Augustine have even learned? Could it be that children are just as diverse as the adults who bring them into the world, with the key difference being that their lack of filters and socialization leave them more raw and honest, and more in touch with themselves, even if they do not yet have the necessary skills to express themselves in a fully comprehensible way? Perhaps some children do need stricter regimentation and discipline to help them achieve excellence in life, while other children need the adults to get out of their way and merely support them on their journey. In any case, it is futile at best and detrimental at worst to ascribe to children any kind of morally charged ontological status, for in doing so we deceive ourselves into an assumption of who they must become because of how we believe they already are. Now, we can return to the political arena of our present moment. While this is far from a perfect comparison, it appears that Augustine's perspective on children, and on humans in general, dwells deeply within American conservatism, while to a lesser degree, some of Rousseau's thoughts on society and children are still alive in American liberalism. As pointed out earlier in the clip from PragerU, some conservative voices today are still willing to ascribe great evil to children, even infants. But that aside, conservatives today are leading the charge in proposing legislation that limits or bans gender-affirming care for children, as well as bans on books and subjects in schools that would encourage a child to learn about gender, sexuality, racism, and other social issues. Certainly, conservatives have many other stated reasons for these bans, but hidden among these reasons is the belief that children cannot think for themselves, or at least not well, and being helpless and naive, if not outright prone to evil, they will fall right into the myriad of traps that the city of man has laid out for them. Opposing these bills are the liberals, who rally around the psychologists and pediatricians who support and provide gender-affirming care, and the teachers who deal directly with the students with whom they are now forbidden from discussing a great many things, even menstrual cycles. The liberals take this stance in part because they resonate with Rousseau's optimism about what a child is already capable of doing, learning, and becoming, and have faith in children as a whole. Hence, it is these two perspectives which clash with each other today through the vessels of conservatism and liberalism in the United States. Ultimately, neither view is perfect, particularly insofar as they both axiomatically state a presupposition about the moral quality of human nature. However, in politically practical terms, Rousseau's default optimism is far more helpful than Augustine's pessimism. Augustine's attitude in his Confessions is one of a deep paranoia toward himself and others. And when paranoia is a driving force within politics, nothing good can result from it. But unbridled optimism is also dangerous, though perhaps more subtly so. Therefore, we should have a cautious faith in one another, a vigilant hope that believes that no matter our shortcomings, we can always do better. As far as children are concerned, this cautious faith should shine even more brightly, for they have so much more of a future ahead of them than the adults in their lives. So what is a child? To put it simply, a child is a little human, imperfect and diverse as the rest of us, who certainly may not know as much as we adults think we do, but who will often surprise us with what they do know and what they can do and become. Trust the children, and understand that sometimes they need protected from us arrogant adults more than they need protected from themselves. Thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like it and share it, and please make sure to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this in the future. Also, leave any comments about topics you would like me to discuss in other videos. I'll see you next time.